The dinner that cracked everything open. The invitation had said smart casual, which meant Vivian Mercer spent 40 minutes telling Ethan that the navy suit made him look like a banker and the gray one made him look like a banker who'd given up. He wore the charcoal in the end, and she fixed his collar at the door with quick, practiced fingers, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked at him the way she used to. Like he was hers, and she knew exactly how lucky that made her. The gala was held at the rooftop of the Aldrin Hotel, all warm Edison lighting and jazz so smooth it felt like a rumor. Vivian's company had been running events for 15 years, and this anniversary party was her design, from the floor arrangement to the floral installations hanging like small golden clouds above the bar. Ethan had told her it looked stunning when they arrived, and she'd squeezed his hand and said, "I know, right?" Not from arrogance, but from that particular joy of a person who'd worked hard and could finally see the result. He loved her most in those moments. Competent and glowing and entirely herself. Then Derek Hollis appeared. Derek was Vivian's colleague, senior vendor coordinator, which as far as Ethan could tell meant he attended parties professionally and wore watches that cost more than Ethan's monthly materials budget. He was tall, loud in the easy way that certain men are, and he greeted Vivian by holding both her hands and telling her the room was her, which made her laugh in a way Ethan hadn't heard in weeks. Ethan got himself a drink. He told himself it was fine. He told himself this for the next 2 hours, watching Vivian drift through the room but always returning to Derek's orbit. Her hand on his forearm, her head tilting back in laughter, the way she leaned close to say something and stayed close a breath too long. Ethan spoke to colleagues. He smiled. He answered questions about the Riverside development project he'd been designing for 8 months. He was, by all appearances, perfectly fine. The drive home was quiet in a way that had texture to it, like something had been stretched too thin and was now vibrating at a frequency only Ethan could hear. Vivian kicked off her heels in the passenger seat and hummed something soft, her eyes on the passing streetlights. "That went well," she said. "Did it?" Ethan said. She turned to look at him. "You're doing the voice." "I don't have a voice." "You have a voice, Ethan. It's the one where you say normal words but mean something completely different." He pulled into their building's garage and sat with the engine running for a moment after he parked. Then quietly, calmly, he said, "You spent most of the night with Derek." Vivian reached for her shoes. "I was working the room." "He's a colleague." "You touched his arm 11 times." "I counted." She looked at him then, a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or irritation at being counted. She chose to laugh softly instead. "Ethan, it's flirting. It's completely harmless. You know I come home to you." Something in his chest went very still. "If flirting is that harmless," he said, his voice even and low, "then maybe being single would be even more harmless for you." The laugh stopped. Vivian stared at him. She waited for the smile that would signal a joke. It didn't come. Ethan's eyes were steady and tired and entirely serious, and Vivian felt the bottom of something drop away, a floor she hadn't realized she'd been standing on until it was gone. She opened her mouth. Closed it. He got out of the car, and the sound of his door shutting echoed in the concrete garage like the period at the end of a very long sentence. Ethan was gone before Vivian woke up. Not unusual, technically. He had early site visits sometimes, and she was a deep sleeper, and the coffee maker was set on a timer, so the apartment smelled warm and ordinary when she finally padded into the kitchen at 8. She told herself this meant last night had passed. That it had dissolved the way most of their small friction did, into coffee and morning light and the comfortable forgetting that marriage made possible. She texted Derek. "Last night was a success. The Aldrin crew loved it," face with tears of joy. He replied immediately with a gif of someone doing a victory dance. She laughed at her phone. She was still smiling when she arrived at work, and she was still telling herself everything was fine when Ethan didn't reply to her midday hey message. Not even a thumbs up. Ethan always replied with at least a thumbs up. Across the city, Lena Cross put a coffee on Ethan's drafting table without being asked and looked at the elevations he'd been staring at for an hour without touching. "You haven't drawn a single line," she said. "I've been thinking." "About the cantilever or about something else?" Ethan picked up the coffee. "Vivian," he said simply. Lena sat down across from him. She'd known Ethan for 4 years, had watched him fall harder for Vivian at the firm's holiday party than she'd ever seen a composed man fall for anyone. She didn't push. She just waited. "She thinks flirting is harmless," he said. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm the problem. Do you actually believe that?" He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Vivian was reorganizing a vendor spreadsheet when her phone buzzed with Ethan's name. Not a text, a call. She picked up quickly, relieved. "Hey, I was starting to think you were ignoring." I'm going to stay somewhere else for a few days, he said. I need to think. And I can't think clearly when I'm there. The spreadsheet blurred in front of her. Ethan, you're being dramatic. I'm not angry. I'm not punishing you. I just need space to figure out what I actually want. What you want? Her voice climbed. We're married. You don't get to just. Viv, his voice was so gentle it frightened her. I'll have my phone. I just need a few days. The call ended. Vivian sat very still. Then she drove home faster than she should have, as if catching him before he left would undo something. She turned her key in the lock to find the apartment looking entirely normal, except for the small overnight bag sitting by the door like a patient, quiet accusation. Ethan was in the bedroom, folding a second shirt. She stood in the doorway and watched him and felt something she hadn't felt in years, actual fear. Not the surface-level anxiety of a fight or a bad week. Something deeper. Something that whispered you have been careless with something precious. Please don't go, she said. He looked at her. There was no coldness in his face, that almost made it worse. He walked toward her and stopped a foot away, and for a moment she thought he would reach for her, but instead he just looked at her steadily. I'll call you, he said softly. He picked up the bag. She didn't move from the doorway until she heard the elevator close. The apartment was the same size it had always been. It had never felt this large before. What the mirror says when no one else is watching. Vivian cleaned the apartment on the first day. Not the regular kind of cleaning, the obsessive 3 a.m. kind, where she reorganized the spice rack alphabetically and scrubbed the grout in the bathroom with a toothbrush and told herself she wasn't crying because her eyes were just irritated from the cleaning spray. On the second day she called her sister. Nina Cross, older by 4 years, twice as direct and entirely unwilling to tell Vivian what she wanted to hear, picked up on the second ring. He left, Vivian said. Tell me what happened. She told her. All of it, the gala, Derek, the car park, the overnight bag. She left out the part where she texted Derek a laughing gif the morning after because that felt too small and too damning to say aloud. Nina was quiet for a moment. Viv, you've been doing this for years. Doing what? Needing rooms to look at you. Vivian opened her mouth to argue. Instead she sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs had decided they were done. That's not. I watched you do it at my wedding. I watched you do it at Mom's retirement dinner. You need every room to feel it. And Ethan's been watching you need it from other people for God knows how long. Nina's voice wasn't cruel. It was the particular gentleness of someone telling a truth they've waited too long to say. Why can't you just need it from him? Because, Vivian stopped. Because needing it from him meant he might not give it. Because desire felt safer when it was distributed across strangers who didn't matter. Because her father had been the kind of man who parceled out approval like it was rationed, and she had spent 31 years performing for people because the alternative, asking directly, wanting directly, felt like standing at the edge of something very high with no guarantee of wings. She sat on the kitchen floor and cried properly for the first time in what felt like years. Ethan, in a quiet hotel room on the 14th floor, sketched floor plans to keep his hands busy. A residential project. Open-plan kitchen bleeding into the living room, large windows, a reading corner built into the wall by the bedroom door. He looked at it for a long time before he realized it was their apartment. The one they'd chosen together, the one she'd painted 3 different shades of white before settling on the first one. He called Lena at 10. Can I ask you something honest? Always, Lena said. Do you think some people just stop loving each other? Gradually? Without noticing? Maybe, she said. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking if you still love her. Long pause. That, Ethan said slowly, is exactly the problem. Lena was quiet. Then you already have your answer about whether it's worth fighting for. He looked at the floor plan on the paper. The reading corner. The window light he'd drawn in careful diagonal lines. Yeah, he said. I think I do. Vivian called on a Thursday, 10 days in. Ethan picked up before the second ring, which they both noticed and neither mentioned. I don't want to fight, she said. I just want to talk. Actually talk. Can we do that? They met at a small cafe 3 blocks from their apartment. Neutral enough to feel safe, close enough that it still felt like theirs. Ethan was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees he'd ordered without asking, because he still remembered she took oat milk and 1 sugar, and that small fact lodged in Vivian's throat the moment she sat down. It was awkward at first. They talked around the edges, the apartment, whether she'd remembered to water the monstera on the balcony, she had, whether he was sleeping all right, he wasn't. Vivian almost made a joke. She physically stopped herself, felt the reflex rise and pressed it back down. I flirt because I don't know how to ask for what I want, she said instead. Plainly. Like pulling a splinter. Ethan looked at her. I need to feel wanted. Noticed. I always have. And somewhere along the way I stopped believing I could just ask you for that. So I got it from strangers in rooms because it didn't count, it couldn't hurt me, and her voice broke slightly. She held it. It never once made me feel as good as when you look at me like I'm the only person in the building. Ethan set down his coffee cup. Something in his face shifted, the careful composure he'd been maintaining for 10 days, and underneath it was not anger but grief. And underneath the grief, love. The stubborn, inconvenient, deeply rooted kind. I stopped pursuing you, he said quietly. I thought loving someone meant showing up consistently and letting that be enough. I didn't think about whether you could feel it. I assumed. I should have told you what I needed. I should have kept asking. They looked at each other across a small cafe table on a Thursday afternoon, both of them red-eyed in public and not caring even slightly. I don't want to be without you, Vivian said. I don't want that either, Ethan said. But I want us to actually be together. Not just coexisting. She nodded. He reached across the table and she took his hand and held it with both of hers. They saw Dr. Priya Weston for the first time the following Tuesday. The session was uncomfortable and slow and necessary, the kind of conversation that feels like moving furniture in a cramped room, painful and awkward until suddenly there's space. Dr. Weston asked them each to say one thing the other didn't know they needed. Ethan said he needed Vivian to tell him when she felt unseen instead of performing for someone else. Vivian said she needed Ethan to reach for her sometimes, without waiting for her to reach first. They walked out of the building into October air, and Ethan reached for her hand and she felt it all the way up to her sternum. That wasn't as terrible as I expected, she said. Next week might be worse, he said. Probably, she agreed. They walked home together. Slowly. Like they had somewhere to be and had decided, mutually, that it could wait. The night they chose each other again. 3 months later the apartment had learned new sounds. There were notes now, small ones, Ethan's architect handwriting cramped and careful, left in places Vivian would find them throughout the day. Tucked under her coffee cup. Folded into her jacket pocket. Once, memorably, taped to the bathroom mirror so she found it before she was fully awake, bleary-eyed and soft. You make ordinary rooms feel like somewhere worth staying. She kept every one. They lived in the drawer of her nightstand, a collection of small, ordinary, extraordinary things. Vivian had done her own quiet work. She'd started therapy separately, individual sessions with someone Dr. Weston recommended, a soft-spoken woman who helped her trace the architecture of her need for external validation all the way back to a father who praised performance and withheld warmth. It was not fast work. It was not comfortable. She was beginning to understand the most important thing she'd ever done for herself. Derek Hollis had not existed in her phone for 11 weeks. On a Friday in December, while Ethan was at a late site meeting, Vivian came home and began to transform their apartment. She cooked the pasta from their second date, the one they'd made together in her old studio apartment, the one where she'd burned the garlic twice and he'd laughed so freely that she'd thought, this is the one, this is the person. She set the table with the good dishes, the ones they saved for guests and never used for each other. She found the candles from a box in the hall closet and lit enough of them that the living room became a different kind of place. Softer, amber, like being inside a memory. She changed into the green dress. The one Ethan had once seen her in at a fundraiser and gone very quiet and then leaned close to her ear and said, you are genuinely unfair to every other person in this room, and she'd laughed and not quite believed him. She believed him now. She was learning to. When she heard his key in the lock she stood in the kitchen doorway, and Ethan Mercer walked into their apartment and stopped. He stood in the entrance and looked at the candles and the table and the green dress and the woman wearing it, and something moved across his face, layered and complex and beautiful. The particular expression of a man who is seeing for the first time clearly how close he came to losing something irreplaceable. Viv, he said, and his voice was different, stripped of the careful composure he'd spent years perfecting. Sit down, she said softly. I made dinner. They ate slowly, unhurried, the way they hadn't in years, talking about small things that became large things, the way conversations do when two people have finally learned how to listen. She told him about a breakthrough she'd had in therapy, and he listened with his full attention and asked the exact right question afterward. He told her about a design detail he'd been stuck on for weeks that suddenly resolved itself this morning, and she leaned forward on her elbows and said, tell me more, and meant it entirely. After dinner he did the dishes without being asked, which she used to take for granted and now watched with a particular tenderness, and she came behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face between his shoulder blades and stood there, simply. He dried his hands. He turned inside her arms and looked down at her, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, tilting her face to his. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For fighting for this. For not letting it be easier to walk away." She kissed him, slowly at first, the relearning kind, and then with intention, with the full weight of 3 months of distance and honesty and the long careful work of choosing each other again. His arms pulled her in and she felt the exact moment his composure dissolved completely, felt him exhale like a man setting something heavy down after a very long walk. They moved from the kitchen to the hallway, from the hallway to the bedroom, the candles burning softly in the other room, the city murmuring 14 floors below, and what happened between them in that quiet amber dark was not the urgent blind heat of early love but something richer. Two people who had seen each other clearly, flaws and fears and all, and chosen to move toward each other anyway. It was slow and full of attention, the kind of intimacy that can only exist between people who have survived something together. She said his name like it meant something specific. He pulled her close like he understood the distance that had existed between them and was erasing every inch of it. Afterward, Vivian lay with her cheek against his chest, his heartbeat steady under her ear, his hand moving slowly through her hair. The candles had burned lower. The city lights came softly through the curtains and painted soft shapes on the ceiling. "I almost lost the only person who ever loved me without needing me to perform," she whispered. Ethan's hand stilled in her hair. He pressed a long kiss to the top of her head. "I should have told you every single day that you didn't have to," he said quietly. "I'm going to spend a long time making up for that." "We have time," she said. "We do," he agreed. Outside, December moved through the streets, cold and sparkling. Inside their apartment, among the burned-down candles and the good dishes still warm from the meal, among the notes in the nightstand drawer and the green dress folded now over the chair and the two people who had nearly let pride and silence dismantle something irreplaceable, inside all of that, something had quietly and permanently changed. Not back to what they were. Forward. To what they were finally, honestly becoming.